Okay, I feel like we're never going to stop talking about water, but at the same time, I won't complain because looking at a picture like this, I am fascinated by water. I have a healthy fear for the ocean. In that, I mean, looking at something like this, can you imagine being caught under this wave and how powerful it is? But just there's so much to the oceans. So we are going to dive into that a little bit more. But yes, we are on to another unit. Another one is gone out of there. So we're kind of cruising on through these units. We're more than halfway through. So first, let's touch on, before we get into oceans in general, I just want you guys to see. First of all, I thought this was an awesome picture. Again, anytime you look up any pictures of water, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just love water. But this was such a cool picture that basically is showing just the water of the earth. You can see that water makes up 70% of our earth, okay? And oceans alone make up 97% of our actual water. So oceans are obviously the most abundant, but our hydrosphere is basically all the water that compromises our earth. It's pretty amazing to think about how much that is, but really only 3% that we are actually able to use. Kind of nutty. But anyways, let's touch on the different oceans. Hopefully you guys know these, but at the same time, it's funny. I realize that when I am trying to think of what ocean is where, I have to really think about it. So get to know these because it will come in handy. You will have to know these at some point for just, just your basic knowledge. But you have the Pacific Ocean over here, which is the largest ocean. It basically encompasses all this area over here and then all the way over to Asia. Okay. You have the Atlantic Ocean that basically you have North America and South America, and then on the other side you have Europe and Africa. Okay, that's the second biggest ocean. Then you have the Indian Ocean, that's basically all kind of right in here. You have the Southern Ocean that's down by Antarctica, and then you have the Arctic Ocean up north. So those are the different oceans. Each one has different qualities and different characteristics, but obviously they still are all encompassed in the oceans. They have, the saltiness that every ocean has. So I won't go into too much more detail about each ocean in particular, but know where they are, know where they're located. Okay? Now, I have to say, just as you can read, I dislike the salt. I love the ocean, but can we have an ocean that doesn't have salt? Because I just hate the taste of it. But anyways, that's not the point. Oceans are made the way they are made for many reasons. But have you ever wondered, and I have to say, up until recently, I can't say that I knew always where the salt in the ocean came from. Did it just fall from the sky? Did, I don't know, did the big salt shaker come down and sprinkle everything with salt? No, probably not, right? Okay, and I actually want to show you this picture before I tell you where it did come from. But here you can see that there is always kind of a boundary where freshwater is going to meet the ocean. So you have this freshwater, saltwater boundary where now all of a sudden what was kind of freshwater has now, the concentration has turned more salty. Okay, but let's talk about where that salt comes from. It comes from particles that water picks up as it runs over the land. There is sodium within our ground, okay, and basically sodium chloride is part of, and not in huge amounts because it's not like you see the, earth bubbling forth with salt. Some places you do, but you do have a lot of salt content within the land, and so as water runs down it, it will pick that up. Okay, all the water that runs into streams, rivers, and runoffs picks up the salts from the land, eventually carries them to the ocean, where they become concentrated and make the ocean water salty. But on the other hand, freshwater, all of the streams and rivers and lakes that we know as freshwater, basically comes from rainfall or snowfall. Okay, well obviously that's not salty, so therefore that's why we have freshwater versus saltwater. So saltwater is typically from the runoff that picks up that salt from the land. Okay, so FYI. All right, the differences between the two. Okay, there are quite a few differences between saltwater and freshwater. Besides the fact that it just tastes salty, we have a lot about the well, first. Oh, I wanted to get into density, but that's coming next. Sorry. Brain fart real quick. Okay, so the oceans, a couple of differences before I get into the density, because that's one thing that I really wanted to touch on, because you guys will be doing a lab on that. But oceans contain unique life forms that cannot live in freshwater. And really vice versa. A lot of freshwater fish will not survive in that saline that the saltwater has. But I love the life forms that come from the ocean. It is amazing to see what creatures are in the water, in the salt water, in the depths. I mean, it's crazy. So that's a big difference, right? Also, the density has a lot to do with it. Saltwater has a higher density and a lower freezing point than freshwater. And you guys will realize when you start to do your freshwater, or I think it's a saltwater lab, you are going to be comparing the two. And you'll see that as you increase the amount of salt into water, the density becomes a lot higher than, say, freshwater. And so therefore, anything that is of a lesser density than the water is going to float. So if any of you guys have ever been to Utah and you've been swimming in the Great Salt Lake, you float because the salt is so concentrated there that you actually end up floating. Now, it's more concentrated than even in the ocean because you don't necessarily float in the ocean. But there are many places that you do. The Dead Sea is a huge high salt concentration, as well as the Great Salt Lake, so you would see that you would be floating because you are less dense than the water. Makes sense, right? Where in freshwater, okay, you don't have that salt content, so the egg is less dense is more dense than the actual water, so that's why it sinks. Okay? So there's a few differences between saltwater and freshwater. All right, now characteristics of ocean. The salinity, or the amount of dissolved salt in the ocean water, makes it freeze at a lower temperature than freshwater. So basically, you're not going to see a lot of oceans freezing. Okay, when you get to even the South and North Pole, you have bits and pieces of ice, floating around, but there's a huge amount of water that is not frozen solid because it has a lower freezing point, okay? It also increases the density of the water so that a boat will float higher in saltwater than in freshwater. So just like we talked about, the fact that if you have an object that's less dense than the water, if you're in saltwater, it's going to actually float a little bit higher. Where then if you go put that same boat in freshwater, it's going to sit a lot lower, okay? Just kind of, little fun facts for you. All right, some more characteristics. The various temperatures and the densities of water in the oceans, they can cause circulation of water in the oceans. So basically, you have temperatures of water that maybe the surface of the water gets a little bit more heated. So, you might have this circulation where the colder water is going to sink faster, the warmer water is going to stay up, and as it cools down, it kind of causes these currents. And currents are the paths of continuous water movement in a certain direction. The map above shows some major ocean currents and how they move. So basically, just because of temperature differences and density differences, sometimes you'll have little pockets of areas of the oceans that have a higher density or a lower density than other parts. But that's causes for these currents, which constantly happen and becomes more of a pattern. So that's why we have some of those ocean currents. Now let's talk about the ocean floors. I think this is another fascinating part about the ocean. How deep do you think an ocean is? I know you can't answer me right now. I can't really hear you. You can answer me, but I won't be able to hear you. But obviously, take a guess. Okay, think about how deep you think an ocean can get at its deepest point. Okay, now think about that, and now I'm going to show you 7 miles in some areas. 7 miles. I mean, think about what 7 miles is. I'm a runner sometimes. Right now I happen to be a runner. And so when I have some of my long runs that are 8 or 9 miles, and I think of how long I'm running, so 7, 8 miles, I'm running in about an hour and a half or so, or a little bit more. So basically, I think of the distance I covered, and that's how deep the ocean is. It's just crazy to try and think about that. So, all right, think about the pressure. Can you imagine being 7 miles underwater and what that pressure would be like? It would crush you, okay? So I don't think that we could ever make it 7 miles down without being crushed by the pressure. Even just we can scuba dive to a certain depth, but even then you have to pressurize your ears. If any of you guys have ever been scuba diving, you know what I talk about. You know what I'm talking about. So it's kind of interesting to think about how much pressure. The pressure can be as high as 8 tons per square inch. 8 tons! It's hard to even kind of fathom what 8 tons is, let alone per square inch. Okay, so water has a lot of pressure, clearly. All right, so mountains under the ocean. Have you ever thought about that? Did you know that mountains exist under the ocean? Kind of cool. There are long chains of underwater mountain ranges. They're called mid-ocean ridges. And some of them are as big and long as the mountains that we have here in Colorado, the Rocky Mountains. So it's pretty crazy to think that there's huge mountains under the ocean. I don't think about that. So anyways, take that into consideration. So I wanted to show you guys your course real quick. There's something that was really cool in your course that I liked. So make sure you're obviously reading through this lesson, taking notes. But this particular picture here I thought was awesome. Because what it is showing you, some of these depths. You have the ocean trench down here. You have the abyss that shows you right here. But let's read through each of these. The trenches, it says pressure in the deep ocean trenches would be like having a 48 Boeing 747 jets. That's not just one 747, 48 747s on top of you. However, some types of plankton can actually live here, being very well adapted to the extreme pressure. Tube-worms also live there as well. So there are still some creatures that are able to live in this ocean trench area. Kind of nutty, right? Then we go to the abyss, which I don't know if you guys have ever seen that movie. It's a lot older movie, and I loved it as kind of like a teenager. One of my favorite movies. But the abyss was like, you could never go down to the abyss because it was dark and no light and crazy. But that's not even the lowest of the low. So the abyss is the deepest and darkest part of the ocean. The animals here sometimes are colorless and blind. They do not need eyes since they live in complete darkness. Squid and octopus live in this zone. So it's kind of cool to think about the abyss, the deepest, darkest part. Okay? So kind of nutty. Midnight zone. The midnight zone is very dark. It has cold temperatures, high pressure. Mollusks, jellyfish, and some whales live here. They rely on materials falling down from above as food source. And then here in the open ocean, you have kind of all three of these. So I'm going through the midnight zone is the lowest. Twilight zone receives less light than sunlight because it's deeper, right? It's gonna receive less sunlight than the sunlight zone. But you begin to find animals like fiery squid or firefly squid, which can produce light like a firefly in the process of bioluminescence. And then the sunlight zone is where most of the sunlight can still penetrate the water. Okay, this area has some light and supports swimming fish like tuna, whales, and sharks. So anyways, I just loved this picture because I thought it gave you a good idea of what lives where, and that you still have different life forms really, really deep within the ocean. Okay. All right, now moving back to our little PowerPoint here. So let's talk about up on top. We talked about deep below, but shorelines are really, I think they're really kind of fascinating. If you were to look at some of the shorelines of different coastal areas, they're so cool. Okay, so shorelines are places where the water meets the land, obviously, but the shape of them, and in your text, I believe in the unit, it talks about how different different coastal forms are formed by the waves, and they are due to the waves. I mean, even though this is more like an island, the shape of the coast is due to typically the waves and that erosion of how the waves can kind of hit against. Now, this is fairly calm water here, so you might see a little bit of erosion, but the sandbars are still formed due to this ocean, okay? And then this one obviously has more waves, so it kind of breaks up some of this land and constructs these shorelines, and I just think it's so cool how some of them are constructed. So there's a little bit on shorelines. So there's so much more that we could talk about with oceans, but this is just one little snippet out of your entire block. And if you guys are very interested, there are so many courses that you can take, especially in college when you get there, that specify on, oceanography and, marine biology and different things that you can really talk about and get to know a little bit more about the ocean. So before we end, I want to leave you with yet another amazing video. This one has awesome ocean footage. It's about 15 minutes long, so if you get bored, you can always turn off the video, but talk about some fascinating things with the ocean. So watch this. just so many cool things to see. Part of me is like, I wish I lived under the ocean. That's what my daughter says every day. I wish I was a mermaid. Anyways, there's a little bit about oceans. Hopefully, again, you took away something new. But maybe we'll talk more about water later. Maybe not. See ya.